across the centuries. Stars stretched endlessly in every direction, their light filtered through layers of armored void glass that could withstand plasma storms and void kraken alike. Yet Ambassador Athraxis of the Calethian Conquered stood before that cosmic tapestry with nothing but contempt curling his triple-jointed lips. "One planet," he said, his voice carrying the harmonic resonance that marked his species as natural orators. 4 compound eyes glittered with barely concealed disdain as he gestured toward the viewing ports. "Your entire civilization springs from one single world, and yet you dare negotiate with the Conquered as equals?" Commander Tiberius Rex of the Imperial Navy stood motionless, his augmented physique encased in the crimson and gold of a high-ranking officer. Cybernetic implants gleamed at his temples, and a service recordo, stretching back through campaigns that would break lesser men, weighted his shoulders with an invisible burden. He had learned patience in the grinding meat grinder of 100 war zones. He had learned restraint, watching good soldiers die for inches of contaminated soil. And he had learned, most importantly, when to let an opponent's ignorance become their weakness. "One planet," Athraxis repeated, warming to his theme as his diplomatic entourage chittered agreement in their clicking. Multi-layered language. The Calethians had evolved on a world of shallow seas and endless archipelagos, and they carried that maritime heritage in every sinuous movement. Athraxis himself stood nearly 3 meters tall, his scaled hide shimmering with iridescent patterns that shifted with his emotions. "The Conquered spans 47 star systems. 47. Our ships have plied the void for 20,000 of your years. Our philosophers debated the nature of consciousness while your ancestors painted in caves." Tiberius allowed the faintest smile to touch his scarred features. Behind him, Lieutenant Lyson Mordecai maintained her parade rest with the discipline of a soldier who had served under the commander's command through the Kelvin incursion. Her augmetic eye whirred almost imperceptibly as it recorded every word, every gesture, every micro-expression of the Calethian delegation, standard protocol for first contact with potentially hostile species. Though in truth, the Imperium had encountered the Calethians generations ago, cataloged them, assessed them, and filed the data away in archives so vast they required their own worlds just to house them. "You speak of your history with pride," Tiberius said, his voice carrying the low rumble of a man who had shouted orders over the thunder of orbital bombardments. "That is natural. All civilizations take pride in their accomplishments." "Natural?" Athrax's dorsal crest flared in agitation, displaying warning colors that would have sent his evolutionary ancestors fleeing for deeper waters. "Do not condescend to me, human. Your kind emerged from Terra's gravity well only 15,000 cycles past. Barely yesterday in civilizational terms. The Conquered was ancient when your species discovered fire." The other Calethian diplomats shifted, their translucent membranes flickering across their eyes in what their species considered a show of unity. There were 7 of them in total, each representing one of the Conquered's 7 primary castes. Scholar priests, void navigators, gene sculptors, resource coordinators, military strategists, cultural interpreters, and Athraxis himself, a speaker of consensus, the highest diplomatic rank their society could bestow. "And yet," Tiberius continued, unmoved by the display, "here we stand, on a human station, in what you would consider imperial space, negotiating terms that you requested." Athraxis' hide flushed deep, purple, an unmistakable sign of anger in his species. "A temporary arrangement. The Conquered merely wishes to establish parameters for coexistence in this region. Your expansion has been noted and tolerated, but there are limits, Commander. Limits that even your aggressive species would do well to respect." "Limits," Tiberius repeated, tasting the word. He had heard it before from the mouths of orc warlords who thought their hordes uncountable, from Eldar farseers who believed their psychic might supreme, from Tauwater caste negotiators who calculated the Imperium's logistics and found them wanting. Every time, the word meant the same thing. A civilization that had grown comfortable in its strength, unable to comprehend the true scale of what it faced. "Yes, limits," one of the other Calethians spoke up, a gene sculptor named Thraxis, whose bioengineering expertise had shaped 3 of the Conquered's colony worlds to their species' needs. His voice carried less polish than Athraxis, but more passion. "We have observed your settlements, crude, inefficient. You terraform worlds through brute force rather than elegant biological adaptation. You wage war with projectiles and explosives when psychic manipulation would be cleaner. You are primitives with starships, nothing more." Lyson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Tiberius recognized the tell. She was 3 seconds from responding with exactly what her combat training suggested. He raised one finger, a tiny gesture that froze her in place. The lieutenant had served under him long enough to know what that meant. Patience. Let them talk. Let them reveal themselves. "I see," Tiberius said. "And what does the Conquered propose, given our primitive nature?" Athraxis drew himself to his full height, his diplomatic robes flowing around him like living water. Behind him, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the posturing of mortal beings. The Concord is prepared to offer you a most generous arrangement. We will recognize your claim to Terra itself and 3 neighboring systems. In exchange, you will acknowledge Concord's supremacy in this sector and agree to a moratorium on further expansion. We will even provide you with technological assistance to help you manage your limited holdings more effectively. It is more than fair, Commander. More than your one-world civilization could reasonably expect. The silence that followed was profound. Even the background hum of the station's life support systems seemed to fade into insignificance. Somewhere in the depths of Concordia's reach, servitors went about their eternal routines of maintenance and prayer. Cogitators processed data streams from 1,000 worlds, and in the command centers that honeycombed the station's core, officers monitored fleet positions across a volume of space that would take standard ships decades to traverse. Tiberius looked at Athraxis for a long moment, then he turned to Lyson. Lieutenant, please show our guests the administratum census. Lyson's augmetic eye flickered. The full census, sir? The full census. Commander, that will take... I'm aware of how long it will take, Lieutenant. Please proceed. Lyson saluted crisply and moved to one of the observation dome's control pedestals. Her fingers danced across haptic interfaces, and suddenly the void glass began to shimmer with hololithic projection. Overlays. The stars remained visible, but now they were joined by other lights, clusters, networks, chains of illumination that spread across the visible sky like glowing veins. What is this? Athraxis demanded, his composure cracking slightly. Some kind of navigational display? In a manner of speaking, Tiberius replied. Each light you see represents a world under the aegis of the Imperium of Man. Not colonies, Ambassador, not outposts, worlds, fully settled, defended, and contributing to the Imperial tithe. The lights continued to multiply. What had started as scattered points became a web, then a net, then a blazing constellation that dominated the hololithic display. The Calithian diplomats had gone very still, their natural bioluminescence dimming in what Tiberius recognized as unconscious fear response. In this sector alone, Lyson reported, her voice professionally neutral, the census records 43,712 worlds. This includes hive worlds, forge worlds, agri worlds, shrine worlds, fortress worlds, and various specialized planetary classifications. The data is current as of the most recent administratum sweep, which concluded 4 standard cycles past. Athraxis' hide had gone pale, the iridescent patterns freezing into rigid shock displays. 40,000? In this sector, Tiberius repeated. Would you like to see the full imperial census? That's impossible, Athraxis whispered, his scholar's mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. No civilization could administer such a volume of territory. The logistics alone are handled by the administratum, Tiberius said, one of several organizations dedicated to the functioning of the Imperium. Would you like to meet our local administratum overseer? He can explain the filing systems in detail, though I warn you, he tends to go on for hours about proper requisition form formatting. Lyson continued working the controls, and the hololithic display zoomed out, the perspective shifting to show not just the local sector, but neighboring regions. More lights appeared, thousands more, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The exact count varies slightly depending on administrative cycles and whether we include worlds that are currently in the process of reclamation from Xeno's occupation or chaos corruption, Lyson explained, her tone almost apologetic. But the current estimate places the total number of Imperial worlds at approximately 1,247,896. Athraxis stumbled backward, his triple-jointed legs trembling. His entourage surrounded him, making concerned, clicking sounds in their native language. The speaker of consensus had devoted his entire life to diplomacy, to the careful dance of power and compromise that governed relations between star-faring species. He had negotiated with the silicon-based crystallark communes, with the methane-breathing void wanderers, with the psychic slith and their serpentine wisdom. He had considered himself an expert in the delicate art of reading strength and weakness in potential allies and adversaries. But this was beyond his comprehension, beyond any frame of reference his civilization possessed. 1,000,000 worlds, he breathed, his translator struggling to convey the disbelief in his voice. Impossible. No species could. The sheer scale of administration, of logistics, of military deployment necessary to hold such territory is considerable, Tiberius agreed, which is why the Imperium maintains the Departamento Munitorum to coordinate military forces, the Navis Nobilidae to facilitate faster-than-light travel, the Adeptus Mechanicus to maintain our technological base, the Ecclesiarchy to provide spiritual guidance, and dozens of other organizations working in concert. It's not always efficient, Ambassador. In fact, it's frequently quite the opposite. But it endures. He gestured to the hololithic display, where worlds glowed like droplets of light suspended in an ocean of darkness. You see, the Imperium was not built in an age of enlightened reason or peaceful expansion. It was forged in the fires of old night, in an age when humanity nearly destroyed itself and had to claw its way back from extinction. Every world you see represents a battle fought, a war won, a fortress held against enemies that would see us extinct. We are not an elegant civilization, Ambassador. We are a civilization that survives. The military strategist of the Calithian delegation, a scarred veteran named Caraxes, found his voice. Your military forces. How many soldiers does it take to garrison 1,000,000 worlds? Lyson looked at Tiberius, who nodded permission to answer. The Imperial Guard alone maintains approximately 500 trillion soldiers across all theaters of operation. This does not include planetary defense forces, which are locally raised and maintained, nor does it include the Adeptus Astartes. The what? Athraxes interrupted, grasping at the unfamiliar term like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. Space Marines? Tiberius said simply. Post-human warriors, created through genetic enhancement and psycho-conditioning to be the ultimate soldiers. There are roughly 1,000,000 of them, scattered across 1,000 chapters, each one worth 100 ordinary men in combat. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. And that's just the military forces we acknowledge openly. It doesn't count the Inquisition, or the Officio Assassinorum, or the Grey Knights, or any of the other specialized organizations that operate in the Emperor's name. The cultural interpreter, whose role was to help her people understand alien societies, made a sound like breaking glass. This is a nightmare, she whispered in accented Gothic. You are describing a nightmare made manifest in steel and flesh? No, Tiberius corrected gently. We are describing humanity. We are not the oldest species in the galaxy, Ambassador Athraxes. We are not the wisest, or the most technologically advanced, or the most psychically gifted, but we are perhaps the most stubborn. When the universe tells us we cannot survive, we build 1,000,000 worlds and dare it to prove us wrong. Athraxes was breathing rapidly now, his gills flaring in distress. Behind him, the Void Navigator was performing calculations on a portable cogitator, cross-referencing the displayed data against known astronomical charts. The numbers kept coming up the same, and each confirmation drove the reality deeper into the Calithian consciousness. The terms you offered, Tiberius continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, were insulting, Ambassador. But I understand why you made them. You looked at humanity and saw primitives who got lucky, who stumbled into the void without truly understanding what they'd found. You saw our wars and our inefficiencies and our seemingly barbaric approach to technology, and you assumed we were weak, vulnerable, easy prey for a civilization as refined and ancient as yours. He stepped closer to the Calethian, close enough that Athraxes had to look down to meet his eyes. Let me be very clear, Ambassador. The Imperium of Man does not kneel. We do. Not pay tribute. We do not acknowledge the supremacy of any Xenos power, no matter how ancient or powerful they believe themselves to be. We have stood against horrors that would shatter your conquered like glass. We have fought wars that would reduce your 47 systems to ash and memory. And we have endured for 10,000 years through sheer, bloody-minded refusal to die. The observation dome was utterly silent. Even the background sounds of the station seemed to have faded into insignificance. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the gulf of understanding that had opened between two civilizations. One ancient and proud, the other seemingly newborn but vast, beyond comprehension. However, Tiberius said, his voice softening slightly, the Imperium is not without mercy. We did not build 1,000,000 worlds to then throw away lives in pointless conflicts. If the Calethian conquered wishes to establish trade relations, to exchange scientific knowledge, to perhaps even coordinate responses to mutual threats, these are things we can discuss as equals, as two civilizations navigating a dangerous galaxy. Athraxes looked at the commander with new eyes. The arrogance had burned away like morning mist, leaving behind something approaching respect. Or possibly fear. Perhaps both. We will need to confer with our government, the ambassador said, his voice hoarse. What you have shown us changes everything. The Conquered's entire understanding of galactic power structures must be revised. Take all the time you need, Tiberius replied. The Imperium has waited 10,000 years. We can wait a while longer. As the Calithian delegation began to file out of the observation dome, their earlier swagger replaced by shell-shocked silence, Lysan allowed herself a small smile. That was almost cruel, sir. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is shatter someone's illusions before those illusions get them killed, Tiberius said. He was still watching the hololithic display, still seeing the 1,000,000 points of light that represented humanity's defiant grip on the stars. They came here expecting to intimidate primitives. Instead, they found an empire, Better they learn that lesson here in safety than out there where their ignorance might start a war they cannot possibly win. Do you think they'll accept the offer of cooperation? Perhaps. Or perhaps they'll return to their conquered and warn others to give the Imperium a wide berth. Either way serves our purposes. He turned away from the display, his augmetic implants glinting in the starlight. The Imperium has enough enemies, Lieutenant. We don't need to make new ones out of simple misunderstanding. Lyson nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Sir, if I may speak freely? Always. Now, the ambassador's initial assessment wasn't entirely wrong. We are inefficient. We are brutal in our methods. Compared to species like the Calethians, who've had 20,000 years to refine their civilization, we are in many ways primitive. Tiberius smiled, and for a moment the expression made him look younger, less weathered by the countless battles that had shaped his life. Yes, Lieutenant. We are all those things, but we're also here, still fighting, still surviving, still pushing back against a universe that wants us dead, and in the end that's all that matters. He clapped her on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that transcended rank. Come, we have reports to file, and I believe Captain Draven wanted to discuss the fleet redeployment schedules before the next convoy arrives. They left the observation dome together, leaving behind the hololithic display still showing its tapestry of worlds. 1,000,000 points of light in the darkness, 1,000,000 fortresses against the night, 1,000,000 testaments to humanity's refusal to accept extinction. Behind them, the stars continued their eternal wheeling, and somewhere in the vast darkness between them, the weight of 1,000,000 worlds pressed down upon reality itself, bending it to humanity's indomitable will. Captain Draven Cross cut an imposing figure even by Imperial Navy standards. Nearly 2 meters of scarred muscle and cybernetic enhancement, he commanded the eternal vigilance, with the casual competence of a man who had spent 4 decades in the void. His ship was a dictator-class cruiser, a veteran of countless engagements, her hull scarred by plasma fire and asteroid impacts, but her guns still ready to speak the Emperor's judgment. He stood now in the command throne, his direct neural interface feeding him data from every system aboard his vessel. The Eternal Vigilance wasn't alone. She ran as part of a patrol squadron that included 2 Dauntless-class light cruisers, 4 Sword-class frigates, and a supporting cast of escort ships and supply vessels. Not a fleet, capable of conquering systems, but more than adequate for maintaining order in the relatively peaceful regions near Concordia's reach. Or so he had thought. Captain, his augur officer called out, her voice carrying the slight distortion of someone speaking through a respirator implant. We're detecting anomalous readings at the edge of the system, multiple warp signatures resolving into real space. Draven's fingers tightened on the throne's armrests. Warp signatures meant ships, and ships appearing unannounced in Imperial space meant either incompetence or hostility. IFF transponders? Negative, sir. They're not broadcasting Imperial codes. Battle stations, Draven ordered, his voice carrying throughout the ship via Vox network. All hands to combat readiness. Launch fighters and prepare boarding torpedoes. Somebody find out who these people are before I have to blow them out of my sky. The Eternal Vigilance came alive with purpose. Across her length, crews raced to their positions with the practiced efficiency of countless drills and actual combat. Weapons batteries powered up, their machine spirits singing with anticipation. Shield generators hummed to life, wrapping the cruiser in layers of protective energy. Fighter craft launched from the hangar bays, their pilots eager for action after weeks of routine patrol. Sir, I'm getting identifiers now, the augur officer reported. They're Calethian vessels, 47 ships total, ranging from frigate equivalents to Emperor's Throne, sir, their flagship massing approximately 8 million tons. That's super dreadnought class. Draven felt his blood cool in his veins. 47 warships was a serious battle group, easily enough to overwhelm his patrol squadron. The fact that they'd arrived in force suggested this wasn't a diplomatic follow-up to the earlier meeting. This was something else entirely. Get me Commander X, now. While his communications. Officer worked to establish contact with Q, Concordia's reach. Draven studied the tactical display. The Calethian fleet had emerged from the warp at the system's outer reaches, well beyond the effective range of his guns, but close enough to be a clear statement of intent. They were holding position, not advancing, but not retreating either. Waiting. Sir, Commander Rex is on secured Vox. Commander, this is Draven. We have a situation. The Calethians are back, and they brought friends. Lots of friends. Tiberius's voice came through crisp despite the distance. I'm seeing the same data, Captain. Hold your position, but do not, under any circumstances, open fire unless fired upon first. Sir, with respect, if they decide to engage, we won't last 10 minutes against that kind of firepower. You won't have to last 10 minutes. Trust me, Captain. Keep your formation tight and your shields up, but let them make the first move. The Vox clicked off, leaving Draven to stare at the tactical display and wonder what exactly the commander knew that he didn't. The Calathian fleet continued to hold position, their ships arranged in a defensive sphere that spoke of military discipline and careful planning. These weren't raiders or pirates. This was a coordinated naval deployment by a civilization that knew what it was doing. "Sir," the augur officer said quietly, "I'm detecting what looks like a communications laser targeting the station. They're trying to establish contact." "Of course they are." Draven leaned back in his command throne and tried to calm his racing heart. In his decades of service, he'd faced orc raiders, elder corsairs, and even a brush with a chaos warband. But this felt different. This felt like standing on the edge of something that could spiral into a war that would consume entire sectors. All he could do was wait, watch, and pray that whatever Commander Rex had planned, it worked. Ambassador, Athrax's looked different than he had during their first meeting. The arrogance had been replaced by a wary respect. But beneath that, Tiberius could see something else. Determination. The Calathian had returned not to capitulate, but to test the boundaries of what he'd learned. "Commander Rex," Athraxis began, his translator conveying formal respect this time rather than contempt. "Thank you for agreeing to this second meeting. I was under the impression it wasn't a request given the fleet you brought with you." Tiberius gestured to the tactical displays showing the Calathian vessels. "That's quite a show of force, Ambassador." "A necessary precaution," Athraxis replied. After our previous discussion, the Concord's leadership decided that a stronger negotiating position would be prudent. Tiberius almost laughed. "Almost. You came back with your entire military and expect me to believe this is about negotiation?" "It is," Athraxis insisted, his crest flaring in agitation. "Commander, please understand. What you showed us 3 days ago shattered everything we thought we knew about humanity. The Concord's entire strategic doctrine, our understanding of galactic power dynamics, all of it built on the assumption that we were dealing with a minor power expanding beyond its means. To discover instead that we had unknowingly bordered an empire of 1,000,000 worlds." He trailed off, and for a moment Tiberius saw genuine fear in those compound eyes. "We had to respond, Commander. We had to show that the Conquered is not without strength, that even if we cannot match your numbers, we are not to be dismissed or absorbed. So you brought a fleet to demonstrate you're worth talking to," Tiberius said. "As a species, you've survived 20,000 years through careful diplomacy and measured response, and in that time, you've learned to gauge the strength of those you deal with. But you misjudged us, and now you're terrified that mistake will cost you everything." Athraxis was silent for a long moment. Then, "Yes." The honesty was surprising, refreshing even. Tiberius had dealt with enough alien species to know that pride often prevented such admissions. That Athraxis could set aside his earlier arrogance spoke well of his character. "Your fear is understandable," Tiberius said, "but misplaced. The Imperium is not interested in conquering the Calathian Conquered. We have more than enough territory to administer, and adding your 47 systems would provide minimal strategic benefit while creating significant logistical headaches. Then what do you want?" "The same thing I wanted before. To establish parameters for coexistence, to perhaps find areas of mutual interest where cooperation benefits both our peoples, to ensure that we're not enemies by default, simply because we share borders." Athraxis studied the human carefully. "You speak of cooperation, yet you command a military station in a system we have traded in for generations. You speak of peaceful coexistence while your empire sprawls across the galaxy like some vast, hungry organism consuming everything in its path." "The Imperium expands because humanity expands," Tiberius replied. "Every world we claim was either unoccupied, willingly joined us, or was taken from enemies who would have used it to attack us. We don't conquer for glory or resources alone, Ambassador. We conquer to survive. Every world we hold is one more fortress against the darkness, one more place where human children can grow up under the protection of the Imperium rather than under the heel of Xenos slavers or chaos cultists." He moved to stand beside Athraxis, both of them looking out at the stars beyond the void glass. "I won't pretend the Imperium is without fault. We are brutal when we need to be. We are unforgiving toward our enemies. We have done terrible things in the name of survival. But we have also endured, against odds that would have broken lesser species, against threats that would have seen us extinct 100 times over, and we did it by being willing to do whatever it took to protect our own." "And what happens when protecting your own conflicts with the sovereignty of others?" Athraxis asked quietly. "That depends on the others in question. The Imperium has trade agreements with dozens of xenospecies. We have non-aggression pacts. We have even, in rare circumstances, formed temporary alliances against mutual threats. We're not unreasonable, Ambassador. We're just very, very careful about who we trust." A priority alert chimed on Tiberius's data slate. He glanced at it, his expression carefully neutral, then looked back at Athraxis. It seems we're about to have an object lesson in exactly why the Imperium maintains such a large military. What do you mean? Tiberius gestured to one of the observation dome's auxiliary displays. Your fleet isn't the only one that's just arrived in system. The display shifted, showing a new set of sensor readings. Athraxis stared at them in confusion for a moment before his translator helpfully converted the Imperial notation into something he could understand. Then his hide went pale. That's a green-skinned fleet? Orcs, Tiberius confirmed. Approximately 200 vessels of varying sizes, composition, and structural integrity. They were probably drawn by the concentration of ships in the system. Orcs have a sixth sense for good fights. 200 ships against our combined forces. Athraxis was already calculating, his scholar's mind running the numbers. Even with your patrol squadron and my fleet working together, we'd be outnumbered nearly 3-1. And greenskins fight with a savagery that makes up for their technological deficiencies. They do indeed, Tiberius agreed. But here's the thing, Ambassador. That patrol squadron, you see, that's not the Imperium's response to threats in this sector. That's just routine patrol coverage, maintained to deal with pirates and smugglers and the occasional lost merchant vessel. He pulled up another display, this one showing much larger scale strategic data. When a real threat emerges, the Imperium responds appropriately. Captain Draven transmitted an emergency alert the moment your fleet emerged from the warp. That alert went out across the Departamento Munitorum's emergency network, and the closest available response force began mobilizing immediately. How close? Athraxis asked, dreading the answer. Approximately 3 hours away at maximum warp velocity. They should be arriving any moment now. As if summoned by his words, reality tore open. Not the relatively gentle emergence of standard warp travel, but a series of violent ruptures in space-time itself. One after another, massive vessels dropped into real space, their Geller fields still. Crackling with the energies of the warp as they translated back to the material universe. Athraxis watched in horror as the fleet continued to grow. Not dozens of ships, not even hundreds, but thousands. Battleships that dwarfed his civilization's largest vessels, cruisers that moved in perfect formation, escorts that numbered in the hundreds, and supporting them all, vast mobile space stations bristling with weaponry and fighter craft. This, Tiberius said quietly, is Battlefleet. Obscurus, second expeditionary formation, approximately 7,000 combat vessels backed by twice that many support craft. Their current assignment is pirate suppression in the Gothic sector, but they've been redirected to deal with this orc incursion. The Calithian ambassador couldn't speak. His translator kept trying to convert his emotional vocalizations into Gothic, but gave up, letting through only the raw sounds of his terror and awe. 7,000 ships, Tiberius continued, representing one of 5 major battle fleets in this segmentum alone. This segmentum, Segmentum Obscurus, is one of 5 major divisions of Imperial space. Each segmentum maintains multiple battle fleets of similar size, and those are just the main forces. Individual sector fleets, system defense forces, merchant marine escorts. The total number of Imperial void-capable combat vessels is difficult to calculate precisely, but current estimates place it somewhere in excess of 300 million active hulls. Athraxis collapsed to his knees, his legs simply refusing to support his weight any longer. Around him, his diplomatic entourage were in similar states of shock, staring at the tactical displays as if watching the end of their civilization unfold in real time. 300 million, Athraxis whispered. 300 million warships. Give or take, Tiberius confirmed. As I said, the exact count fluctuates based on construction, losses, and reclassification of vessels. The Administratum tries to maintain accurate records, but with that many ships spread across that much space, there's always some margin of error. On the displays, Battlefleet Obscurus was already engaging the Orc fleet. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Imperial vessels moved with practiced coordination, their weapons batteries opening up in devastating broadsides that tore through the green-skinned ships like paper. Orc vessels, held together more by force of will and random chance than actual engineering, exploded in brilliant fireballs or simply fell apart under the withering fire. Lance batteries cut swaths through the enemy formation. Torpedo spreads overwhelmed point defenses and detonated deep within enemy hulls. Fighter craft swarmed over the larger Orc vessels like angry hornets, their lascannons finding weak points and exploiting them ruthlessly. And through it all, the Imperial fleet advanced with the inevitability of a tidal wave, unstoppable and merciless. Within 20 minutes, it was over. The surviving Orc ships, less than a dozen out of the original 200, had fled back into the warp, their dreams of a good scrap shattered by overwhelming force. The Imperial fleet immediately shifted into recovery and cleanup mode, rescue boats launching to search for survivors from damaged vessels, while salvage craft began cataloging the wreckage for potential useful materials. Tiberius watched the aftermath with the tired eyes of a man who had seen this scenario play out countless times before. The Orcs will be back, he said, They always come back, but each time we kill them, we buy time. Time for worlds to be built, for children to grow, for civilization to take root. That's what the Imperium does, Ambassador. We buy time with blood and steel and absolute refusal to surrender. Athraxis looked up at the commander with something approaching reverence. We thought we understood power. We thought our 47 systems made us important. But we're nothing. Less than nothing. A single breath in a hurricane. No, Tiberius said firmly, extending a hand to help the Calethian to his feet. You're a civilization that has survived for 20,000 years through wisdom and careful planning. You've achieved things the Imperium likely never will. Peace, stability, cultural refinement. Those aren't weaknesses, Ambassador. They're achievements. We can barely imagine. He helped Athraxis stand, meeting those compound eyes with his own augmented gaze. The Imperium is vast, yes, but vastness isn't everything. We maintain 300 million warships because we need 300 million warships just to survive. We span 1 million worlds because anything less leaves us vulnerable. We are, in many ways, a civilization defined by our fears. Fear of extinction. Fear of our enemies. Fear that if we stop fighting, stop expanding, stop struggling for even a moment, everything we've built will come crashing down. The observation dome was silent, save for the gentle hum of life support and the distant rumble of the station's plasma reactors. Outside, Battlefleet Obscurus was already preparing to depart, their job done, moving on to the next crisis that demanded their attention. What happens now? Athraxis finally asked. Between our peoples? That depends on you, Tiberius replied. You came here with a fleet to demonstrate your strength. I've shown you ours. Now we both understand the reality of our situations. The question is, what do we do with that understanding? Athraxis was quiet for a long moment, his alien mind working through implications and consequences that would shape his civilization's future. Finally, he spoke. The Conquered would like to propose a different arrangement than the one I initially offered. One based on mutual respect rather than assumed superiority. I'm listening. Trade agreements, scientific exchange programs, perhaps shared intelligence regarding common threats like the Greenskins. The Conquered has no wish to be absorbed into your Imperium, but neither do we wish to be enemies. We can maintain our sovereignty while acknowledging the practical realities of galactic power structures. Tiberius smiled. That sounds like a much better foundation for relations, Ambassador. I'll need to forward your proposal to the appropriate authorities. Decisions like this go well above my rank, but I think you'll find the Imperium can be quite reasonable when dealing with those who approach us in good faith. And our fleet? Athraxis gestured to the Calethian vessels still holding position in the outer system. A perfectly reasonable escort for a diplomatic mission, Tiberius said, though perhaps next time you might want to send advance notice before bringing quite so many heavily armed ships into Imperial space. Captain Draven gets nervous when people appear unannounced. For the first time since their initial meeting, Athraxis allowed himself something like a laugh. It came out as a series of melodic chirps, translated by his device as genuine amusement. Noted, Commander. Though I suspect Captain Draven has little to fear from our vessels after what we've just witnessed. Never underestimate yourself, Ambassador. Overconfidence is how civilizations fall. Tiberius extended his hand in the gave human gesture of greeting. But humility tempered with strength, that's how they endure. Athraxis studied the offered hand for a moment, then reached out with his own triple-jointed appendage. The grip was awkward. Neither species built for the other's gesture of respect, but the meaning was clear enough. Two civilizations, two very different paths through the stars, but perhaps, just perhaps, a way forward that didn't end in fire and blood. The chamber was a work of art, all flowing. Curves and bioluminescent panels that shifted colors based on the emotional states of those present. 7 seats arranged in a circle representing the 7 primary castes of Calethian society, with Athraxis occupying the speaker's position as the newest member of the primary council. His elevation had been rapid, pushed forward by his successful negotiation with the Imperium. The trade agreements were already bearing fruit. Imperial tech priests had provided designs for more efficient plasma reactors in exchange for Calethian expertise in biological adaptation. Merchant vessels from both civilizations now moved along established trade routes, their cargoes protected by joint patrol agreements. But tonight's council meeting wasn't about trade. It was about something far more serious. The exploratory fleet has returned, announced Vecrix, the military strategist caste representative. His scales bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, though those campaigns seemed almost quaint now compared to what they'd learned of the Imperium's endless wars. Their report is disturbing. Athraxis settled deeper into his seat, his gills fluttering with apprehension. What did they find? 7 Xeno civilizations in the region beyond our traditional borders, Vecrix reported, all of them showing signs of rapid militarization, all of them expanding aggressively, and all of them, without exception, paying careful attention to the movements of Imperial forces. Another council member, Lithara of the Scholar-Priest caste, leaned forward. They're preparing for war, not with us. With the Imperium. Fools, Athraxis muttered. Have they not done even basic reconnaissance? Do they not understand what they would be facing? Apparently not, Veckrix said. Or perhaps they do, and they believe that if enough civilizations band together, they can overwhelm the Imperium through sheer numbers. A coalition of the threatened, united against what they perceive as an existential threat to all Xenos life. Athraxis felt his blood chill. He had seen the Imperium's response to a relatively minor orc incursion. He had studied the tactical data from that battle, analyzed the fleet compositions, calculated the resource expenditure, and he had come to a terrifying conclusion. The Imperium could have sent a tenth of that force and still achieved victory. They had deployed overwhelming power not out of necessity, but out of doctrine. Because, to them, anything less than total dominance was unacceptable risk. If these civilizations attack the Imperium, he said slowly, what happens to the regions between Imperial space and their territories? We would be caught in the crossfire, Lithara confirmed. Refugee fleets would flood through our systems. Battle debris. Potentially even fighting as Imperial forces pursued retreating enemies. The Conquered could be devastated without a single shot being fired at us directly. The council chamber fell silent. The bioluminescent panels shifted to dark blues and purples, reflecting the collective anxiety of those present. We must send delegations, Athraxis said finally, to these civilizations, to warn them, to show them what we've learned about the Imperium's true nature. Will they listen? Another council member asked. We barely believed it ourselves until we saw it with our own eyes. Then we show them, Athraxis replied. Commander Rex gave me full, tactical recordings of the orc engagement. With his permission, I can share those with other species. Let them see what we saw, let them understand what they're contemplating. And if they still choose war, Athraxis met the questioner's eyes, then we make it very clear that the Calethian Conquered will not join their coalition. We will maintain our neutrality, and if necessary, we will petition the Imperium for protected status during the conflict. The suggestion sent ripples of shock through the council. To seek protection from another species was nearly unprecedented in Calethian history, but Veckrix, surprisingly, nodded in agreement. Better to swallow our pride and survive, the old warrior said, than to maintain our dignity and face extinction. I've studied the humans, my fellow council members. I've read every bit of tactical data I could access, spoken with their military officers, observed their training exercises, and I've come to a conclusion that should terrify all of us. He activated a hololithic display showing comparative military data. The Imperium doesn't just have more ships than everyone else. They have an entire philosophy of war, built around the assumption that they will face numerically superior enemies with technologically superior weapons. They train for scenarios we can barely imagine. They maintain doctrines for fighting in conditions that would kill most of us outright. They have contingencies for threats we haven't even encountered yet. Numbers scrolled across the display. Kill ratios, resource expenditure rates, fleet response times, logistical capability assessments. If the coalition these civilizations are building attacks the Imperium, Veckrix concluded, the war will be brief and brutal. The Imperium will not seek negotiations or conditional surrenders. They will prosecute the conflict to its absolute conclusion, and that conclusion will be the complete destruction of everyone who raised arms against them, because that's what they've done for 10,000 years. That's how they survived. Athraxis thought of Commander Rex, that scarred, weary human who carried the weight of countless battles in every movement. He thought of Lieutenant Lyson, young by human standards, but already a veteran of campaigns that would fill volumes. He thought of Captain Draven and the casual competence with which he commanded a warship that could reduce planets to ash. And he thought of the million worlds that had produced soldiers like them, a million worlds of veterans, of warriors, of people who had been taught from birth that survival meant eternal vigilance and overwhelming response to any threat. We will send the delegations, Athraxis said firmly. We will do everything in our power to prevent this war. But if it comes anyway, he looked around the council chamber, meeting each member's eyes in turn. Then we survive. Whatever it takes. That's what the humans have taught us, if nothing else. That survival is worth any price, any compromise, any sacrifice. We endure. The council voted. Unanimously, they approved Athraxis' proposal. Within hours, diplomatic vessels were being prepared, their crews briefed on the critical importance of their missions. The Calethian Conquered, ancient and wise, was about to become the unlikely voice of reason in a region sliding toward catastrophe. And somewhere in the vastness of imperial space, in offices and command centers and monastery fortresses, humans went about their eternal business of war and administration, completely unaware that a minor Xenos civilization they had negotiated with months ago was now working frantically to prevent a conflict that would draw the Imperium's full attention. It was, perhaps, the greatest irony of all, that the species the Imperium had been the kindest to was now the one trying hardest to save others from the Imperium's wrath. Captain Draven studied the tactical display with the grim satisfaction of a man who had predicted exactly this outcome. The Coalition fleet, assembled from 7 different Xeno civilizations, over 3,000 ships strong, had finally made their move. They had struck at what they perceived to be a lightly defended Imperial system on the periphery of the region, clearly intending to establish a foothold before pushing deeper into Imperial territory. What they had found instead was Battlefleet Obscurus, 4th and 7th Expeditionary Formations, backed by elements of Battlefleet Ultima that had been rotated into the region, specifically to deal with this threat. 23,000 warships, waiting. It's almost sad, Lyson murmured from her position at the tactical station. She had been promoted to Draven's executive officer in the months since the Clethian incident, proving herself repeatedly in the minor skirmishes and patrol actions that were the bread and butter of Imperial Navy operations. They actually thought they could win. They thought they were facing an empire, Draven corrected. An empire implies centralized control, bureaucratic inefficiency, supply lines that can be cut, and political will that can be broken. What they actually faced was something far more dangerous. On the displays, the battle was unfolding with terrible inevitability. The Coalition forces were brave. Draven would give them that. They fought with discipline and coordination, their varied technologies complementing each other in ways that suggested months of joint training and planning. Under other circumstances, against a more conventional foe, they might even have achieved victory. But these were not other circumstances. And the Imperium was not a conventional foe. Imperial warships advanced in perfect formation, their shields interlocking to create defensive networks that the Coalition's weapons could barely scratch. Lance batteries cut through enemy formations like surgical instruments. Torpedo spreads overwhelmed point defenses through sheer volume of fire. And when the Coalition forces tried to close to boarding range, where their superior close combat capabilities might have mattered, they found themselves facing Space Marines. The Astartes' drop pods hammered into enemy vessels like the fists of angry gods. Within minutes, the ships they targeted were either captured or destroyed from within, their crews slaughtered by post-human warriors who had been bred and trained for exactly this kind of warfare. "Sir," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Admiral Kyrillos aboard the Dominus Aeternum. The Admiral is ordering all non-battleship vessels to begin recovery operations. The engagement is effectively over." Draven nodded slowly. In less than 4 hours, the Coalition fleet had been reduced to scattered survivors fleeing in every direction. The Grand Alliance that was supposed to humble the Imperium had instead been shattered so completely that it would take generations for those civilizations to recover, if they were allowed to recover. "Sir, we're also receiving a transmission from..." Lyson paused, checking her instruments. "From Ambassador Thraxes of the Clethian Concord. He's requesting permission to approach under flag of truce." "Put him through." Thrax's image appeared on the main view screen, and Draven was struck by how much the Clethian had aged in the months since their first meeting. The diplomat's scales had lost some of their iridescent sheen, and his movements carried a heaviness that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "Captain Draven," Thraxes said, his translator conveying weary formality, "I wish to formally offer the Concord's assistance in recovery operations. We have medical vessels standing by and supply ships that can help tend to Imperial." "Wounded?" Draven raised an eyebrow. "That's generous, Ambassador. Though I should point out that the Imperium's casualties have been relatively light. The Coalition bore the brunt of the losses." "I know." Thrax's voice was heavy with sorrow. "We tried to warn them, Captain. We showed them the tactical data from the Orc engagement. We explained what they would be facing, but they wouldn't listen. They thought we had been deceived or intimidated. They thought that, if enough civilizations united, the Imperium could be forced to negotiate or even beaten outright. They were wrong." "Yes." The Clethian's gills fluttered in distress. Now hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of beings are dead because of that miscalculation. Their worlds will be occupied or destroyed. Their civilizations will be reduced to historical footnotes, all because they couldn't accept that some forces are simply too vast to oppose. Draven studied the alien diplomat carefully. "You tried to save them. We tried. We failed." Athraxis met the captain's eyes. "But we can at least help clean up the mess, and perhaps, in doing so, demonstrate to the Imperium that the Concord's commitment to our agreements is genuine." "Your help is accepted, Ambassador. Transmit your vessel coordinates to my tactical officer, and we'll integrate you into the recovery operation grid." After the communication ended, Lyson turned to Draven with a questioning look. "Sir, do you think this was the Concord's plan all along? Position themselves as the reasonable ones, the ones who tried to stop the war, so the Imperium would look on them favorably?" "Probably," Draven admitted. But that doesn't make it less sincere. Ambassador Athraxis genuinely tried to prevent this disaster, that he also understood the political benefits of being seen as the Imperium's ally rather than its enemy just makes him a good diplomat. He turned back to the tactical display, watching as Calethian medical ships began moving toward the debris fields where Coalition survivors might still be found. The galaxy is a dark place, Lieutenant, full of species that would see humanity extinct without a second thought. When we find Xenos who are willing to work with us, who understand the realities of power and survival, we should encourage that, even if their motives aren't entirely altruistic. So what happens now, to the Coalition species? That depends on a lot of factors beyond our pay grade, Draven said. Some will be offered Imperial client status, allowed to maintain limited autonomy in exchange for tribute and military cooperation. Some will face occupation and re-education, and some... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Both of them had seen enough wars to know what happened to species that challenged the Imperium and lost. Sometimes there was mercy. Sometimes there was pragmatism. And sometimes there was only silence. For once there had been entire civilizations. Make sure our crews treat the Calethian vessels with respect, Draven ordered. They're allies now, or as close to allies as the Imperium allows. That means something. Yes, sir. As the Eternal Vigilance moved to begin recovery operations, Draven found himself thinking about the strange path that had led to this moment. An arrogant diplomat, humbled by truth. A minor Xenos civilization, learning to navigate the realities of Imperial power. And now, in the aftermath of a brief, brutal war, the first tentative steps toward something that might, in time, become genuine cooperation. The Imperium had survived for 10,000 years through strength and paranoia in equal measure. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was room for something else as well. Not softness, never that, but calculated pragmatism, the recognition that not every Xeno species needed to be an enemy, and that sometimes the greatest strength lay, not in crushing all opposition, but in knowing when to extend a hand instead of a fist. It was a thought that would have seemed naive even a few years ago, but watching the Calethian medical ships moving to help salvage crews from species that had tried to make war on the Imperium, Draven allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The galaxy was still a dark place, but maybe, in some small way, it was getting slightly less dark. Commander Tiberius Rex stood in the same observation, dome where he had first shattered Ambassador Athraxis' misconceptions about humanity. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to the concerns of mortal beings. But the political landscape below those stars had shifted in ways that even Tiberius, with all his experience, had not quite anticipated. Athraxis entered the chamber with the confident grace of someone who had finally found his footing in a larger galaxy. The Calethian had become something of a fixture. At Concordia's reach. Over the past months, serving as the primary liaison between the Conquered and the Imperium, his diplomatic skills, combined with his hard-won understanding of Imperial power structures, had made him invaluable in navigating the complex negotiations that followed the Coalition War. Commander, Athraxis greeted, the term carrying genuine warmth now rather than forced respect. Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice. Ambassador, what's on your mind? Athraxis moved to stand beside Tiberius, both of them gazing out at the stars. I've been thinking about our first meeting, about my arrogance and ignorance, about how close the Conquered came to making a fatal mistake. You learned. That's more than can be said for the Coalition species. Yes, we learned. Athraxis' gills fluttered in what Tiberius had learned to recognize as thoughtful contemplation. But I've been wondering, why did you show me the truth so completely? You could have kept the Imperium's full-strength secret. Let us continue believing you were just a minor power punching above your weight. It might have been strategically advantageous to maintain that deception. Tiberius was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because deception leads to miscalculation, and miscalculation leads to war. I've fought in enough wars, Ambassador. I've seen enough good people die because someone, somewhere, made a decision based on incomplete information. When I looked at you during that first meeting, I saw someone who genuinely believed what he was saying, who had come in good faith, even if that faith was built on false assumptions. He turned to face the Calethian directly. I could have let you leave with those assumptions intact, could have sent you back to your Conquered with tales of primitive humans who got lucky. And then, eventually, when some crisis forced our civilizations into conflict, you would have discovered the truth in the worst possible way. Your fleets would have been destroyed, your worlds occupied or worse, and I would have carried the knowledge that I could have prevented it with a few hours of honest conversation. Athraxis' hide shifted through several colors, displaying emotions too complex for his translator to fully capture. You prevented a war before it could begin. I prevented one war, Tiberius corrected. There are always more. The galaxy is full of species that want what humanity has, or fear what humanity might become, or simply hate us on principle. The wars never really end. We just get brief pauses between them. A grim philosophy. A realistic one. Tiberius smiled slightly. But that doesn't mean we can't try to make those pauses last as long as possible. Which brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you. He pulled up a hololithic display showing a sector map. Several systems were highlighted in amber. Neither hostile red nor friendly green, but something in between. These are minor civilizations that the Imperium has had limited contact with, Tiberius explained. Most of them are aware of our existence, but don't fully understand our scale or capabilities. Some of them are developing coalition plans similar to what we just defeated. Some are simply afraid and arming themselves in preparation for what they see as inevitable conflict. You want the conquered to serve as intermediaries? Athraxis said, understanding immediately. You've proven yourselves trustworthy. More importantly, you've proven that cooperation with the Imperium doesn't mean destruction of sovereignty or culture. If the conquered were to establish diplomatic relations with these species, share your experiences, help them understand the realities they face. It might prevent future conflicts. Athraxis studied the display thoughtfully. The conquered as the Imperium's diplomatic arm in this region. That's a significant role, and a significant risk. Some of these species might see us as collaborators or traitors to Xenos interests. They might, Tiberius agreed, but they'd be wrong. You wouldn't be betraying Xenos interests. You'd be serving the greater interest of survival, of finding a way to coexist with the largest military power in the galaxy rather than pointlessly opposing it. The Calithian was silent for a long moment, his complex eyes reflecting the starlight. Then, there's something I need to tell you. Commander, something the Conqueror discovered during our initial explorations of what we now know to be Imperial space. Tiberius waited, his augmented reflexes unconsciously preparing for a potential threat, even though his conscious mind saw no danger. We found ruins, Athraxis continued. Dozens of worlds showing evidence of previous civilizations, some of them recent enough that our archaeologists could date them to within the last few thousand years. All of them gone, extinct, and all of them showing signs of having been quite advanced when they disappeared. The galaxy is an old place, Tiberius said carefully. Civilizations rise and fall. Yes, they do. But, Commander, every single one of those extinct civilizations showed evidence of contact with humanity, trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and then, suddenly, nothing. Empty worlds and silent monuments. The implication hung in the air between them. Tiberius met Athraxis' gaze steadily. What are you asking, Ambassador? I'm asking if the Imperium has a history of... Athraxis struggled to find diplomatic phrasing. Of eliminating civilizations it once called friends. Tiberius was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of history. The Imperium has existed for 10,000 years, Ambassador. In that time, we have signed treaties with thousands of species. Most of those treaties held, some did not. And when they broke, when species we had trusted turned against us, or fell to chaos, or were revealed to be threats we hadn't recognized, yes, we responded, often with total force. He turned back to the observation dome, looking out at the million worlds that glowed in the hololithic display. The Imperium is not kind, Ambassador Athraxis. We are not gentle or forgiving or enlightened. We are survivors in a galaxy that wants us dead. Every treaty we sign, every alliance we make, every moment of cooperation with Xenos. Species. It's all built on the foundation of one absolute inviolable rule. Humanity comes first, always. If the choice is between preserving a Xenos ally and protecting human lives, we choose humanity. Every time. Athraxis' scales had gone pale. And the conquered? If we became inconvenient, if some crisis forced the Imperium to choose between our survival and human interests, then the conquered would learn what those other species learned. Tiberius met the alien's eyes without flinching. But, Ambassador, that same principle cuts both ways. As long as the conquered's interests align with humanity's, as long as we're not a threat, you have the full protection and support of the Imperium. No species that stands with us has ever been abandoned without cause. We may be brutal, but we're not capricious. The observation dome fell silent. In the distance, patrol ships moved on their eternal rounds, watching for threats that might never come. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, the ghosts of extinct civilizations whispered warnings that no one could hear. I will accept your proposal, Athraxis said finally. The conquered will serve as diplomatic intermediaries to the species you've identified. We will help them understand the realities they face. And in doing so, we will hopefully prevent the kind of catastrophic misjudgment that led to the coalition war. Thank you, Ambassador. But, Commander, I need you to understand something as... Well, Athraxis drew himself to his full height, his diplomatic training giving him the courage to speak truth to power. The conquered survived for 20,000 years by being cautious, by avoiding conflicts we couldn't win, by negotiating rather than fighting whenever possible. We're not cowards. Our history proves that. But we're also not warriors in the way your species is. He gestured to the hololithic display showing the 1,000,000 Imperial worlds. If the day ever comes when the Imperium asks us to choose between our principles and our survival, I don't know which path the conquered will take. I hope we never have to find out. But I wanted you to know that our cooperation, while genuine, has its limits. We will not become what we are not, even for the sake of Imperial alliance. Tiberius studied the Calithian for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That's fair. And honestly, Ambassador, that's part of what makes you valuable as allies. The Imperium has plenty of species who will follow orders without question. Servitor races, client states, protectorates that have been so thoroughly integrated they barely remember their original cultures. But a civilization that maintains its independence, its principles, its identity while cooperating with us, that's rare. That's worth preserving. He extended his hand, and Athraxis took it in the gesture that had become their standard greeting. Two very different beings, representing two very different civilizations, finding common ground in a galaxy that often seemed determined to prevent exactly that. To continued cooperation, Tiberius said. To survival, Athraxis replied. Which, in the end, may be the same thing. As the Calithian diplomat left the observation dome, Tiberius remained behind, watching the stars and thinking about the strange path that had led to this unlikely alliance. The Imperium had faced countless threats in its 10,000 years of existence. Orcs and Eldar and Necrons and 1,000 lesser species, all seeking to carve their own dominions from the galaxy's flesh. The response had always been the same: overwhelming force, uncompromising determination, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. But perhaps, he thought, there was wisdom in what Athraxis had shown him. Not every conflict needed to be resolved through violence. Not every Xenos species needed to be an enemy. And sometimes the greatest strength lay not in destroying your opposition, but in turning them into something else. Not subjects, not servants, but allies who understood the costs of conflict and chose cooperation instead. It was a small victory, measured against the vast tapestry of imperial conquest and resistance. But Tiberius had learned long ago that sometimes the small victories mattered most, that preventing a war could be just as important as winning one, that in a galaxy full of darkness, even a single candle's worth of light was worth preserving. Behind him, the 1,000,000 worlds of the Imperium glowed in the hololithic display, each one a fortress against the night, each one a testament to humanity's refusal to die, each one a burden carried by billions of souls who would never know the true weight they bore. But now, in at least one small corner of that vast empire, that weight was shared by others. By Xenos, who had learned the cost of opposing the Imperium and chosen a different path. By allies, who understood that survival sometimes meant swallowing pride and accepting reality as it was, rather than as they wished it to be. Tiberius allowed himself a small smile. The weight of 1,000,000 worlds was indeed heavy, but shared, even slightly, it became just a little more bearable. And in a galaxy that offered precious few moments of genuine hope, that was enough. The Calithian conquered's homeworld was a place of breathtaking beauty. Shallow seas sparkled under a binary star system, their waters teeming, with bioluminescent life that painted the night in colors humans had no names for. Archipelagos stretched across the equatorial regions, connected by living bridges of genetically engineered coral and kelp. Cities rose from the waters themselves, architectural marvels that blended so seamlessly with the natural environment that it was difficult to tell where biology ended and technology began. Tiberius stood on a platform overlooking one such city, his power armor painted in ceremonial gold for the occasion. Beside him, Ambassador Athraxis wore the elaborate robes of a primary council member, his scales carefully patterned to display the colors of diplomatic accord. It's beautiful, Tiberius said, genuinely awed by the vista before him. Your people have achieved something remarkable here. 20,000 years of careful cultivation, Athraxis replied with evident pride. Every building, every bridge, every living structure you see has been shaped through generations of bioengineering and architectural planning. We don't conquer nature, Commander. We become part of it. They were here for a historic occasion, the formal signing of the Concordia Accords, a comprehensive treaty framework that would govern Imperial Calethian relations for the foreseeable future. It had taken 5 years of negotiations, compromises, and careful diplomatic dancing to reach this point. But the result was something unprecedented in recent Imperial history. A genuine partnership between humanity and a Xenos species, built on mutual respect rather than conquest or subjugation. The Administratum was skeptical, Tiberius admitted. They kept asking what the Imperium gained from the arrangement beyond a single minor ally. I had to explain that preventing wars is more valuable than winning them, that having a partner who can navigate Xenos politics and diplomacy frees up Imperial resources for other concerns. And did they accept that Explanation? Eventually. Though I suspect the real deciding factor was the Inquisition's assessment that the Conquered poses minimal long-term threat and could serve as a useful buffer zone against more aggressive Xenos polities in the region. Athraxis made a sound like wind chimes, his species' equivalent of dry laughter. How wonderfully pragmatic. We're not trusted, merely tolerated as useful. Welcome to dealing with the Imperium, Tiberius said with a slight smile. We don't really do trust. But useful? Useful we can work with. The platform they stood on overlooked a vast amphitheater where representatives from both civilizations had gathered. On one side, Calithian counselors in their flowing robes, their scales displaying the complex emotional patterns of beings who understood the weight of this moment. On the other, Imperial officials in their severe uniforms and ceremonial armor, representing different branches of the vast bureaucratic machine that kept a million worlds functioning. Between them, on a raised dais, sat the treaty documents themselves. Not digital files or psychic imprints, but actual physical books, crafted from materials provided by both civilizations. Paper from Terra's carefully managed forests, inks mixed with bioluminescent compounds from Calithian seas, a fusion of two very different approaches to record-keeping, symbolizing the cooperation the treaty represented. I've been authorized to tell you something, Tiberius said quietly, his voice carrying to Athraxis' auditory membranes, but no further. Something that very few xenospecies are ever told. Athraxis turned to face him, his compound eyes reflecting the light of the binary stars. That sounds ominous, Commander. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's a sign of how far our relations have come. Tiberius paused, choosing his words carefully. The Imperium maintains detailed records of every xenospecies we've encountered. Threat assessments, cultural analyses, military capabilities, technological development, predicted expansion patterns, all of it cataloged and updated regularly. That's not surprising. We maintain similar records. Yes, but there's another layer to our classifications, something we call the extinction priority scale. It ranks xenospecies based on how urgently they need to be eliminated versus how safely they can be ignored or managed through other means. Athraxis went very still. And where does the Conquered rank on this scale? Category Omega-3, Tiberius replied, which translates roughly to a minimal existential threat, potential value as trade partner or intelligence source, active elimination not recommended unless circumstances change dramatically. You're one of only 17 species currently holding that classification out of the thousands we've cataloged. The Calithian diplomat was silent for a long moment. You're telling me this because you've earned the right to know. Because in 5 years of cooperation, the Conquered has proven itself trustworthy within the understood parameters of our relationship. And because I thought you should understand that while the Imperium may not trust in the way your species does, we do recognize value. We do appreciate partnership. And we do make distinctions between those who oppose us and those who work with us. Tiberius gestured to the gathered crowds below. Everyone in that amphitheater represents a choice, Ambassador. The choice to try something different, to see if cooperation can exist alongside the Imperium's fundamental principle of human survival. I wanted you to know that choice is valued, even if it's valued in our own particularly imperial way. Athraxis' scales shifted through a complex pattern that his translator helpfully rendered as profound gratitude mixed with lingering apprehension. Thank you, Commander. Though I must admit, learning that my entire civilization's survival is contingent on maintaining a specific threat assessment category is somewhat terrifying. Everything in the galaxy is contingent, Ambassador. The Imperium's survival is contingent on maintaining military superiority. Your species' survival has always been contingent on careful diplomacy and measured response. At least now you know exactly what the Imperium's parameters are. Music began to play, a fusion of imperial martial hymns and Calithian ceremonial. Compositions that sounded simultaneously alien and familiar. The signing ceremony was beginning. Representatives from both civilizations moved toward the dais, their movements choreographed with careful precision. One more thing, Tiberius said as they prepared to descend to the amphitheater. Your diplomatic initiatives with the other species in this region, the ones we asked you to help stabilize, they're working. 6 civilizations that were preparing for war with the Imperium have instead entered into negotiated agreements. 2 more are considering similar arrangements. You've potentially saved millions of lives on both sides. We simply shared what we learned, showed them the tactical data, explained the realities they faced, offered alternatives to conflict. That's more than most would do. Most civilizations, when they gain an advantage, seek to exploit it for maximum benefit. You used your knowledge to prevent bloodshed. That says something about the Concord's character. Athraxis looked at the human commander with something approaching affection. You know, Commander, when we first met, I saw you as the face of a primitive, aggressive species that had gotten lucky in the cosmic lottery. Now I see you as someone who understands the true weight of command. the burden of making decisions that affect entire civilizations. We're both just trying to keep our people alive, Ambassador. In the end, that's what all this pomp and ceremony reduces to: two survival strategies finding a way to coexist rather than conflict. They descended to the amphitheater together, human and Calethian, walking side by side toward a future neither had imagined 5 years earlier. The treaty documents gleamed in the binary starlight, their pages filled with carefully negotiated compromises and mutually agreed upon boundaries. It wasn't a perfect agreement, no treaty ever was. But it was a genuine attempt at understanding, at finding common ground between species that evolution and circumstance had made fundamentally different. The signing itself was brief but profound. First, the Calethian representatives, each adding their mark in bioluminescent ink that glowed with the colors of their respective castes. Then the imperial officials, their signatures rendered in the severe Gothic script that had served humanity for millennia. And finally, Athraxes and Tiberius themselves, adding their names to a document that would shape the relationship between their civilizations for generations to come. When it was done, when the last signature had been affixed and the last ceremonial word spoken, the amphitheater erupted in a mix of human cheering and Calethian harmonic vocalizations. Two very different expressions of celebration, but united in their genuine enthusiasm for what had been achieved. Tiberius found himself standing beside Athraxes once more, both of them watching the celebrations with the slightly detached awareness of those who understood the true magnitude of what they had just accomplished. "Do you think it will last?" Athraxes asked quietly. "Nothing lasts forever, Ambassador. The Imperium itself will someday fall, no matter how many worlds we hold or how many enemies we defeat. Entropy wins eventually." "That's a grim thought for a celebration." "Is it?" Tiberius smiled. "I don't think so. If nothing lasts forever, then every moment of peace, every alliance that holds, every war that's prevented, they all become more precious, more worth celebrating. We're not immortal, Ambassador, not as individuals, not as civilizations, but we can leave things better than we found them. We can build something that, while it lasts, makes the galaxy slightly less dark." He raised a ceremonial cup filled with Calethian ceremonial nectar, adapted by Mechanicus biologists to be safe for human consumption. To temporary victories, to alliances that last as long as they can, and to the brief, beautiful moments when different species find a way to work together instead of tear each other apart. Athraxes raised his own cup, filled with synthetic wine created to mimic Terra's finest vintages while being compatible with Calethian biology. To survival, to cooperation, and to the understanding that the weight of 1,000,000 worlds is lighter when shared, even slightly with allies who understand its burden. They drank together, human and Calethian, warriors and diplomats, representatives of two civilizations, finding their way through a galaxy that offered precious few guideposts for peaceful coexistence. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, the Imperium of man continued its eternal vigil. 1,000,000 worlds standing watch against the night. 1,000,000,000 soldiers ready to defend humanity against any threat. A civilization built on blood and faith and steel, tempered by 10,000 years of war. But now, in at least one small corner of that vast empire, something else existed as well. Not softness, not weakness, but the recognition that strength could take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest victory lay not in crushing your enemies, but in preventing them from becoming enemies in the first place. The weight of 1,000,000 worlds remained heavy. It would always be heavy. But shared, even slightly, it became just a little more bearable. And in a galaxy that offered precious few moments of genuine hope, that was everything.